Good evening, and welcome to the newest installment in our Unmasked series. My name is Afeni Grace. I am the program coordinator for the Harvey B. Gantt Center. Tonight, we incorporate the voices of assorted community leaders to truly unpack the meaning of police defunding and what that could look like for the Queen City, as well as on a national scale. Before we get started, please be sure to click that subscribe button below the screen and visit our website at ganttcenter.org for updates on all future Gantt Center programs. We do currently have a 2-minute audience survey linked in the YouTube chat. Please take the time to complete that survey now before we dive deeper into the conversation. And of course, audience engagement is very important to us. Please use that YouTube chat for any questions or comments you have throughout the evening. If you do have questions for our panelists, please get them in as early as possible so that we can try to get them answered in the time that we do have. We will address the audience questions and the audience survey in the second half of the program. We, of course, welcome back this evening's moderator, Dr. Keith Cradle. Keith is the Director of Youth Programs for the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office. He ensures the implementation of successful rehabilitation and youth development initiatives for justice-involved youth in the county. Welcome back, Dr. Cradle.
Thank you, Afeni, and good evening. Thank you all for joining us again, and thank you to the Gantt Center for having us with another critical conversation to talk about things that we can do to help our community get better and get stronger. Tonight, we have 3 amazing panelists, all of whom you should be familiar with, and if you're not, then please get ready to get more in depth with who they are and what they're doing to help our community. First up, Christy Puckett-Williams. Christy Puckett-Williams is the statewide Campaign for Smart Justice Manager for the ACLU of North Carolina and is a working scholar in mass incarceration with a focus on the treatment of women, including pregnant women in carceral facilities. Christy holds an MA in Human Services Counseling, Addiction and Recovery Counseling. Having survived domestic violence, drug addiction, and long-term incarceration via community corrections, she is now an advocate and activist fighting for the rights of all marginalized and disenfranchised people. Christy, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Dr. Cradle. Thank y'all so much for having me tonight.
Well, I'm surprised you got time for it. You had a big dance party this afternoon outside of CMPD, a little Biggie Hypnotized.
Yes, we did. We had a farewell retirement party for our police chief today.
Okay. And so our second panelist tonight, Clarissa Brooks. Clarissa Brooks is a journalist, writer, and community organizer, originally from Charlotte, North Carolina. Clarissa works to blend her love of community, ethical journalism, and prison abolition in a way that will create a world without cages. Clarissa is a Charlotte for Black Futures Coalition member, a digital organizer for 350.org, and has worked in ending gender-based sexual violence for over 4 years. From mobilizing communities, hosting teach-ins, leading direct actions, and centering abolition in her frontline work, her love for community always comes first. And she is a 2018 grad of Spelman. Clarissa, how you doing?
I'm good today. How are you?
It's all good. What's the vibe up in DC?
It's hot. It's too hot for it to be DC. So I'm very much ready to come back to Charlotte.
Well, it's hot here too, so you aren't missing much. And our last panelist tonight, Councilman Malcolm Graham. Malcolm Graham is the District 2 representative of the city of Charlotte, an experienced businessman, dedicated public servant, and powerful public speaker, especially on the topics of race and discrimination, community, and common sense gun laws. He's a Charleston, South Carolina native who has lived and worked in Charlotte, North Carolina for over 30 years. Malcolm believes that our economy is stronger when more North Carolinians have an opportunity to participate in it. He has held positions committed to fostering diversity and inclusion at the Carolinas Minority Supplier Development Council, Inc., Bank of America, Time Warner Cable, and Bovis Lend Leasing. Councilman Graham, how you doing? Gotta turn the mic. Can we hear you?
I am doing great. How are you doing?
I'm good, fellow Smithite. And I know you've had a long day already. We just heard some disturbing news, 2 teens shot on Beatty's Ford. That is your district. So how are you dealing with that right now?
We're trying to reinsure the community that the police department is doing their job, which is to protect and serve. We're also trying to communicate with our young people that violence is not the way to accomplish anything, and that we all must work together to help one another. It's just a tragedy that would happen on the corridor. And as you know, in your job, that we've got to find ways to make and have creative change within our community.
Well said. And so, with the time that we have, we want to just jump into these questions because you all are a wealth of knowledge and information. So I'm going to start off with you, Christy, because, when we talk about defunding police departments, there's a lot of misinformation about that. A lot of people might have their own perception or their own definition. So can you give us the proper definition of what defunding means, and particularly here for Charlotte, North Carolina?
Sure. So it really means a reallocation of funds to community-based organizations and resources that actually create the safety that we say we seek when we police people. So defunding is simply reallocating funds. It's a divestment from policing and surveillance and control in the community, and an investment in resources. We know that the people who live in the community, who are part of the community, are closest to the problems, but they're also closest to the solutions. What they are furthest from is the resources and the power. And so what we are fighting for, what we are pushing for, is to make those resources and power more readily available so that the community can respond in ways that help create trust, healing, reduce the amount of trauma that the community experiences. Poverty is traumatic, right? Poverty is violent. And so until we can begin to really hold the various systems accountable for the ways in which they create, sustain, and perpetuate violence against the community, then we will never really truly see the public safety that we say we seek when we invest in policing.
Thank you. So I want to dive over to Councilman Graham, because one of the things I recognize, particularly having conversations in the community, is that many of us probably need a civics lesson. We don't recognize or understand really about city or county government politics. So let's talk about the city budget, because that's a part of what when we talk about defunding. So can you walk us briefly through what does the process look like for the city budget, how it's set, and how does CMPD request their funding?
That's a great question. The City Council starts its budget negotiations, deliberations in January of each year. We have to approve our budget by July. So it starts by working with various departments within city government to capture the information for the budget. The city council has a retreat where we kind of set out our priorities for the year. And then each of those department heads are there with us. They take those priorities in terms of what the council has given them, and they create a budget for their departments. That budget is then forwarded to the city manager, who accepts or approves, make recommendations or amendments to those various department heads. And then they ship that budget to the city council's budget committee. Then we start those deliberations. Each department, like the police department, make a budget request based on their needs for that particular department, i.e. 80% of the police department budget is salary, fringe benefits, cars, maintenance, etc., grants. There's another 20% where I consider needs and wants. And that's the gray area I think a lot of people are talking about in terms of how can we use those funds in a different direction. Long story short, the budget is approved by July of every year. City council has the final authority and word in terms of what budget items are funded from a very general perspective. Sometimes we don't go very deep into those departments' budgets.
Thank you. So I want to, Clarissa, you talk about defunding the police. Talk about the first steps in addressing police brutality as it pertains to defunding police.
Yeah, I think the first step in regards to talking about what that looks like is kind of sitting with like a really hard truth about policing, which is that like the system of policing doesn't keep Black people and marginalized people safe. And I think for a lot of folks, we feel like we have to be beholden to that system because we've been taught that that's how the authority on safety looks in our world right now. And I really think it's sitting with that truth that the police were not created ever in the existence of policing across the country to protect people. It's made to protect property. And secondly, I think it requires us to like really sit with trusting ourselves, trusting Black people, dealing with how anti-Blackness kind of shifts who we put trust in and who we put authority in, because that's really the root of like who we call when things go left. And for me, I know that the Black women in Greer Heights kept myself and my family alive, and that it really, we have to like really sit with who we call when things go left.
And so Councilman, you know, so you're District 2, and you have at-large counterparts. Can you talk about, you know, when you hear comments like that from Christy, from Clarissa, because these are community-based conversations, how does that affect the job you're trying to do, and what are you trying to do to help these folk out get, you know, their point across?
I agree with her in terms of the need for police reform and accountability, right? Obviously, there were a number of examples in Charlotte where the police had let the community down. I think a perfect example is what happened on Batesford Road last Sunday. 181 shots fired, police was right there. And for whatever reason, no one intervened. And so I think there's a skepticism of the police that is real, that I acknowledge. But I also acknowledge the fact that we need the police to kind of protect and serve the community. So it's a double-edged sword in terms of making sure that we balance what's appropriate for our community. And so I concur that we need to really have a deep dive into our police budget to identify those items that they need to protect and serve the community as a whole. And then find out what are those items that are on the margin, right? That we can reinvest in other particular programs that would help job readiness on Batesford Road, that would help individuals with drug treatment, that can help individuals in terms of homelessness, that can help individuals in terms of truancy, getting kids back to school. So I think there's a legitimate debate to be had. Obviously, I believe the police department is needed. The question is to what extent.
So Christy, you know, you're very vocal. Everyone knows you out in the community. You don't need a microphone to amplify your voice at all. So you have a councilman here. What demands, you know, should we be making of our city council members and law enforcement during these times?
Well, first it starts with accountability and transparency. And so what we see a lack of is a lack of accountability at the hands of the police. They will do things to the community and frame it as if the community has done something to them. Literally, the reason we are out protesting is because the police have been brutalizing Black and brown bodies and poor bodies across this country. And the police response was to brutalize us on June 2nd on 4th Street so that they could maintain the ability to continue to brutalize us. So they are willing to brutalize all people to be able to maintain the ability to brutalize Black people. And we saw that display of force, that use of deadly force on people who were peacefully protesting on June 2nd. And so the police are not here to protect and serve. I have to disagree with Councilman Graham. They are here to control and surveil, hence the need for facial recognition technology, hence the need for militarized equipment and riot gear, hence the need for flashbangs and tear gas and rubber bullets and pepper bullets, the things that they label as less than lethal. However, they use those things in ways that can be lethal, that have been lethal, that have done real harm to people. And again, we are people who are exercising our constitutional right to assemble and to use our voices for free speech. And so there has to be a reckoning, truth and reconciliation. They have to acknowledge the very difficult truths. If you turn off the videos and the lives and my profanity, what you will see is the behavior of the police, period. So you don't have to like what I say. You can turn me on mute. Just watch their behavior. And that is the indictment that they are trying to avoid. You know, and so they have what they describe as qualified immunity, but they don't have that type of immunity in the community. In the community, we are going to hold them and the elected officials accountable because people like Councilman Graham and the other council people are directly responsible for the way the police. And so if they cannot get policies and directives in place that help us, the community, keep us safe, then we will have to replace them with people who are more in line with our vision.
So Councilman Graham, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to respond to that.
Yeah, I agree partially with what she said, right? What happened on June 2nd earlier this month was horribly a mistake. Not a mistake, it was just wrong, right? People peacefully protesting racial discrimination, hatred, discrimination. The police, in turn, whether they followed the policy, and that's what the SBI said they did, they followed policy, but the policy itself was wrong, right? And so I make no apologies for the action that happened that night. And so I think she's absolutely right. There has to be some accountability there within the police department. The buck falls on my desk as a member of the Charlotte City Council to ensure that, in fact, the voice of the people is being heard. I hear her loud and clear. I was out there protesting myself as well. And so, again, there's a delicate balance between making sure that the department has the resources that is needed to, I'll use the term again, to protect and serve the entire community. Again, we needed the police today when someone went into a store in Batesford Road and shot someone and someone shot back, and now one person is dead and one is gravely wounded. There was another shooting on the other end of Batesford Road today. And so certainly we need the police to investigate, to show up when they need to protect and serve. But we also need them to, again, reform itself. They won't do it, so we would have to do it with the help of the people. And I certainly believe that if the people will lead, like Christie is leading, the leaders will follow.
Thank you. Clarissa, for context, how long have you been out of Charlotte and in DC?
I actually live in Charlotte, live in Atlanta and Charlotte, just here for a little bit of time. But I graduated in 2014, have been kind of traversing back between those two cities for the past 6 years.
So the question is, so for someone who grew up in Charlotte, what do you think are the most urgent needs and issues the city needs to address?
Yeah, I think the city, also went through CMS schools, Collinswood, Smith, Waddell, and South Meck. And I will specifically say, like, even my class mobilization from Greertown to being able to leave Atlanta was rooted in my mother's tireless work to put me in the magnet program. And that was because she stood in line for hours and hours to get me a magnet ticket. And as we know, CMS is being defunded every year. So what I think really needs to be prioritized is community needs, right? So even the shooting that happened today, what conditions made that possible where somebody felt like they had to rob a store in order to stay alive? I think those are vital questions. And I think that still falls back on city council of why are we investing in 3% out salary increases for police, for administrators, when folks aren't eating, when folks are being evicted during a pandemic? Why are people having to get guns, put themselves on the line to stay alive and provide for people? And I think those are bigger questions that ask us things about like what white gentrifying companies are buying up Charlotte and pushing out poor Black people. How are city council members making money off of that? How are local politicians ignoring the ways that grants and bonds are affecting rent increases for poor Black people? Even thinking about like Chicken Coop is my favorite place. Chicken Coop 4 years ago, Camden, that street looks completely different. There's a juicery next to Chicken Coop, right? Like that does not make sense to me as somebody who grew up in Charlotte. And that's not to say neighbors have to stay poor, but it's to say that anti-Blackness shows up in the fact that we don't trust Black people to make decisions for their community, but we trust white people to make decisions about what their neighborhood should look like.
So that brings me back to you, Councilman Graham. You've done a lot of economic development. So can you talk to a little bit about economic development and what does money under economic development go towards? Because we're talking about, you hear Clarissa, you talk about Chrissy, this funding, these allocations. Some places are being developed, some are not. So can you kind of speak to that?
I think it's a legitimate question. Again, I came to Charlotte in 1981 at Johnson C. Smith University. And if you would take a picture of that corridor, Batesford Road specifically, in 1981 and compare it to today, not much has changed, right? But in 1981, there was no such a thing as Ballantyne, right? And now there's another edge city out there. So certainly, I believe racism and discrimination has played a role in that in terms of how a previous city council developed the city and neglected neighborhoods like Batesford Road and Hidden Valley and Hampshire Hill and other parts of the city. And so now we got to use those dollars, identify those dollars that the city has in our budget to really focus our attention on areas that's been neglected, right? In this year's budget, there's $32 million set aside for corridor revitalization. We're working with 2 African-American business owners. For an example, one is going to do a really good project on the corner of Batesford Road in the south. The other is going to do another project on the corner of Batesford Road in Oaklawn. So we have to be intentional in terms of what the dollars are. We have to make demands of public officials like myself to kind of do our jobs and not be afraid to support Black communities and Black neighborhoods, right? I mean, sometimes people get in power and they kind of forget where they came from or forget who really needs the help. And all my years as a public official, I've been trying to empower neighborhoods and communities. And so I want to use the dollars in our budget to directly impact neighborhoods that need it in terms of supplier diversity, minority business owners, job training readiness program, putting Black folks in business, right? We do it all the time, incentivizing major corporations to come to town and hire folks that don't look like us. Why can't we identify an African-American firm like we're doing now and put this guy in business so he can go into a neighborhood like Batesford Road, hire people that look like us, and begin to reinvest back in our communities? We have to be intentional about our investments.
Thank you. And before I go to my next question, I want to let the audience know our survey will be closing in about 10 minutes. So please make sure you take it and also continue to ask questions in the chat so that way we can ask our guests, our panelists, the things that are on your mind. So I'm going to jump back into my next question. I'm going to go to you, Christy, because I'm seeing a lot of conversation about how can folk get involved. So what are tangible and effective steps that residents can take towards this mission?
So as Clarissa, I think it was stated that most people don't understand civic engagement. And we will be, me and the ACLU will be partnering with the NAACP to teach Civics 101. We'll be talking about how government works, local, state, and federal government. And then helping people to understand the power that elected officials have and understand the process so that they can tap into some of that power. They need to understand that when we vote for Councilman Graham that we are taking our individual power and passing it to him, and he holds our collective power. And so that we can press him to do the things that we say should be done. And how do we do that in effective ways? We do it by protest. We do it by sitting in our policy meetings, attending county commission and city council meetings. We call, we shut down phone lines, we send thousands of emails. We do all of those things, direct action, organizing, all of those are components to civic engagement. People tend to either really like the protesting part, and they think that's the only thing that we do. I see people all the time comment, "Go get a job." Like, hello, this is part of my job, to make sure that we are constantly agitating and disrupting the system so that it does recalibrate in a way that bends the arc of justice more towards marginalized communities. That is literally what we're doing. And people do that in different ways. Everyone doesn't like to march. Everyone doesn't like, some people donate money. Some people donate their most precious asset, which is their time. What we need is people's two most precious assets. We need their time and their money. And we don't need their money so that we can grow our own wealth. It's so that we can reinvest that money into supplies, into advertising, into sign making, all the things that we use and the tools that we use. We need resources for that. And we haven't always been able to depend upon the county and the city to get those resources. And so because of that, our grassroots effort required not just the labor of our physical bodies, it also requires a whole lot of emotional labor. So people need to be prepared to be really upset, to want to cry sometimes, to be so frustrated, to feel like they are trying their best and nothing's happening. And then 2 days later, a bill that you never thought would passes, or this SCOTUS gives a decision that we never thought we would see in our lifetimes, right? And so things are changing, but what it does take is for people to stop being sitting just behind screens and consuming, but also getting out and doing something. Whatever they think is beneficial, I think does help our movement. But people can always follow me on Twitter if they need to, because I'm always doing something. I would say follow Clarissa too. She's always doing something. And so that they can figure out what we're doing and they can get involved.
Thank you. So this next question is for everybody. And so, in the past week, in the past couple of days, we've seen an increase in homicides. So how does and what would defunding the police look like when we talk about violent crime? Because again, people have a lot of questions. They think that, police are just going to evaporate and go away. You're going to take them away off the street. And then folk will talk about, well, there's still crime in the streets. So talk about, again, that parallel conversation between policing, defunding, but also why do you think we're seeing higher rates of homicide in our own community? So I'm gonna start with you, Clarissa.
Yeah, I think this is like the prime question that folks that do abolitionist work is like, what do you do with all of the rapists and serial killers? And what we know right now is that the criminal justice system does not actually lock up rapists and serial killers and folks that cause immense harm. Looking at the numbers of exonerations, looking at the way that the policing system actually polices survivors, specifically the way that it punishes survivors for surviving specifically. And I'll say that from my own personal experience, having lived in Charlotte, that CMPD is not the place you want to call if you've been assaulted, if you've dealt with immense harm. And I think we're seeing upticks in homicide because of the political tensions of the time, but also because, I think it's also just the reality that crime happens, harm happens, and it's not an astronomical number. We see similar rates of violence and harm in white communities. If you go to Ballantyne, they just don't call the cops as much. And when they do, less folks get arrested because of the way that anti-Blackness works. Just in personal experience, having been with survivors who've called CMPD, CMPD will just arrest the survivor and the person who's caused harm. Like that's most times their go-to is like, we'll just arrest anybody here and deal with it later. And so I think because of that, we have to really sit with how anti-Blackness works. I will also say Charlotte media is not the best, has never been in reporting crime, specifically in even having to tell local journalists that like, you should maybe not use an old mugshot of somebody who's been killed because it's harmful and it's disrespectful to their life. So there are various ways why we're seeing this uptick, but I think also it requires us to think about how we trust our community and how we let Black folks deal with stuff going on without having to call the cops, because we've been doing that. But an end in a defunding of the police is our call to make that real.
Thank you. Councilman Graham?
I think that it's a tricky question, right? Homicide rates, not tricky. People do bad things, right? Black folks, white folks, rich folks, poor folks. I'm not putting it into one category. We have a society in which people break laws, break the rules. Some do it because of circumstances. They want to feed their family. They want to. They don't have a job. They want to provide for themselves, and they, the system, which is discriminatory, whether it's the employment system, the educational system, the criminal justice system, they're fighting the system over and over again, and they get frustrated and they lash out. That leads to a pattern of crime. Some people are just criminals, right? Black, white, rich, poor, and they deserve to be punished through the laws. But again, I believe that there has to be a balance between having law enforcement that police our society, our community. I believe that the police should be reformed. I believe there should be accountability. But again, I think that we need the police, and that they should be funded to refund their needs, salary, benefits, cars, those things that make the police department function effective and efficient. But there also is some wants in their budget that we can do without, that can be redirected to providing some of the answers to the social ills in our community. And so I'm walking a fine line because I know we need to do both, right? And I'm committed to working with all the advocates to do a deep dive in the police budget, to identifying those needs from the wants and reallocating those funds to support other programs to advance the community.
Thank you. And Chrissy, I'm going to revisit this question, but we have to get to our survey. So I'm going to head over to Afeni. I know she's waiting in the wings with the survey results, but Chrissy, you just put a pin in that. I'm definitely going to come back to you.
All right, thank you, Keith. Yes, so we're going to switch gears for just a minute and discuss the results of the audience survey. Please keep in mind that these results are only based on our audience members who completed the survey. So our first question was, which course of action would have the greatest positive impact on our city? So as you can see here, we have about a 62% majority of surveyors who selected that defunding police would have the greatest positive impact. And we have about a 38% who selected that it is police reform that would have the greatest positive impact. Our next question was, where should police funds be most reallocated? So we have a 47% about of surveyors who selected that it's social services such as food subsidies, CPS, mental health services, etc. We have 21% who selected that grassroots community-led programs would benefit the most from these reallocated funds. We have about 15% of surveyors who selected that it is youth programs and development who most need these funds. About 10% who selected that it is housing that need these funds. And we have about 6% of surveyors who selected that it is indeed all of the above who equally need these funds to be reallocated. Our next question was, do you believe in a partial or total defunding of police? As you can see here, we have a huge majority of about 79% of surveyors who selected that a partial defunding is needed. And we have about 21% who selected that a total defunding and or abolishment of police is needed. So our final question was more, it required a short answer response. So it asked, what benefits and drawbacks would be most considered in defunding police? And some responses that stood out was reduced resources to respond to the security and needs of the community. Someone said restorative programs and creating programs that focus on creating relationships in the communities that many of the police serve while addressing those systemic issues. Others said the greatest benefit is bringing the community back into focus, and that a drawback would be people struggling with the idea of defunding. And then another response that stood out was that a benefit would be to make strides in decriminalizing poverty and offering more nuanced help for those who need it. So Keith, based on these survey responses, was there something that stood out to you or something that you think you yourself or the panelists need to kind of discuss?
For me, I think I looked at the total, it was about 60% folks said that money should go to social services and programs. So you can definitely tell there's a need for that, and folks are definitely having that conversation. Additionally, I think, again, there's still some misinformation about defunding, because you're still hearing the public safety aspect, in which people are trying to respond and say, if you defund, there won't be any safety. So Christy, I had to put you in the parking lot on that last question, but I also want to, because some of that, the question pertains to the survey results. So go ahead and give your answer to the question, which was about the increase in homicides, but also the survey results and what you saw in that, and kind of some brevity. How we get down.
So I am a victim of violent crime, right? And I experienced a lot of trauma at the hands of the police. So my perspective is shaped by being a victim of crime, and also someone who worked with men who were violently abusive and sexually abusive towards their family members, wives, and or children. And what I learned through that process working with those men was that the violence that we see in the street is due to the toxic masculinity and violence that exists within homes. And so until we can address the toxic masculinity that we have socialized our men and boys into having, then we will continue to see an uptick in violent crime, despite crime overall being down across the country, right? So crime overall is down, but because we have this unchecked patriarchy, paternalism, all of those things, because of that unchecked toxic masculinity that exists, that's why we see people unable to resolve conflict. They're not able to resolve conflict inside of their home. When they go outside of the home, they're unable to resolve that conflict. And so if we truly want to address the trauma and the public safety in our community, we have to make sure that women and children are safe. If we make sure that our most marginalized community members have safety, then every one of us becomes safe. And so that's why we need to look at this gender-based violence issue. In 2018, 28% of our homicides were based on domestic violence, right? And so if we can look at that, then we understand that children are being steeped and raised in homes that have violence and conflict. And then when they pick up a gun, when they turn whatever age and go out and resolve that conflict in the same way, we lock them up. But what we don't understand is that prisons and jails don't create the safety that is needed in order for a person to make the needed changes. It actually isolates them from community. And community is such a powerful resource when we talk about accountability and when we talk about transformation. When I think of myself, I'm a habitual felon. I'm a recovering drug addict. Community was so important to my recovery and to me being the thriver that you see today. It was not the police. It was not social services. It was the community who showed up for me. I just want to caution about social services. Social services has been deputized to harm Black families by separating families every single day through their use of anti-Black policies as a way of looking at Black and brown families and poor families differently than they look at white families. And so the civil legal system is also just as racially disparate as the criminal legal system. And we have to avoid deputizing social workers and other workers to behave in similar fashion as the police.
Thank you. Clarissa, anything about the survey that jumped out to you?
Yeah, I think the survey results made my heart really happy, seeing folks really interested in defunding, because the Charlotte I grew up in was not that survey. So that makes me really happy. I do want to add and uplift everything Chrissy said, and add that some of my most violent experiences with police happen in Charlotte Mecklenburg schools. That as we're talking about deputizing social services, it also requires us to think about police that are in schools, right? Like the video of the young woman in South Carolina who was flipped over a desk at school. We have retired CMPD officers going into schools, brutalizing children. And I learned that very quickly in middle school, right, of getting kicked out for being insolent, for having a tone, for having an attitude. And we know that Black girls specifically are punished in very severe and specific ways in school. And lastly, just wanted to add that like anti-Blackness doesn't need white people for it to exist. Having a Black mayor, and I'll say this for Atlanta and Charlotte, having a Black mayor, a Black woman mayor means nothing to me if you are still investing in the police. And specifically that like, people are not criminals. We are brought up in conditions that are violent, where we cause harm, where we're taught that. So I never a day in my life will I call anybody a criminal, specifically because there are formerly incarcerated folks in my family that I love. And those people are more than the harm that they've caused. So yeah, I think it's like really deeply anti-Black to call people criminals without calling them that in general, but also without being honest about the very violent world we live in, where harm is expected, rewarded, and also Black people are punished for that because of the world we live in. You know what I mean? Like the conditions are important. We can't just call people criminals, white or Black, just because it makes us feel like better people, because we also cause harm. We are just not in jail because of those things.
Thank you. Councilman Graham, survey results, anything jump out to you?
Yeah, I'm pleasantly surprised that it's right where I believe we should be. One, the social service, and we talked a little bit about that in terms of when the police department shows up at the crime scene, it would really be nice that they are accompanied with someone who knows something about mental health and illness, that are social workers there to help with substance abuse. That we're able to provide information regarding housing and helping our homeless population. And so a lot of the calls doesn't require a police response. It requires another type of response to help the individual on the other side of the call. I believe grassroots programs are extremely important. Programs like My Brother's Keepers in Charlotte, boots on the ground, doing the work, understanding the environment, understanding the population. The population looks like them, right? So there's a relationship there. And I think that's really important. Youth programs are really important. We have to occupy our kids and keep them focused and active and always learning and demonstrating to them other alternatives and educational alternatives to be successful. And then the last one was housing, right? Everyone should be afforded a decent place to live. And so I think the survey results reflects where I stand in terms of providing wraparound services and examples of where, if there are savings, or we can identify resources in the police budget that we can reallocate elsewhere. Those are the type of programs I would like to support.
And so now with the time that I have left, I have some questions, from folk that have been watching this broadcast. They're in the chat. So I'm going to kind of randomly go through them, but I'm asking you all, because you all have a wealth of knowledge, I need you to be as brief as possible so we can get to as many as possible and get answers from the three of you. So the first question that I have, and I'm going to toss it, I'm going to go ahead and give it to each one of you, but people have been asking about police in the public school system. So describe what that looks like as we are working to reimagine their role. So Christy, I'm going to start with you, but if you see me touch my nose, I'm cutting you off.
I got you. So police in schools, like right now, we have not seen children being arrested since school has been out for disorderly conduct. That is like the number one thing that children get arrested for in North Carolina is disorderly conduct. And we just haven't seen that. So either their parents are better equipped than the school teachers to deal with behaviors, or we've just decided to rely on the police as a resource instead of figuring out what is going on. Why is this student being insolent? Why is this student, are they hungry? Did their parents have an argument last night and they were up all night listening to argument going on? So now they're tired and they're sleepy and they don't want to do their work, so it comes off as an attitude. Or are they so poor that people are picking on them because their shoes aren't what are those, like the kids say these days, right? Like, what are you wearing? All of those things, these things that we as adults don't think so much about, children have to deal with. But they have the added extra pressure of a police officer standing there that could potentially arrest them for just for them being school age. if they were to do those things and they were not in school, they would not be arrested. So we really have to look at how we invest in our school nurses, in school counselors, in those type of services. The same thing that we talk about in the larger community. We need to be investing in those resources in our schools as well. Tutors, after school, making sure children can read on grade level. You know, sometimes kids get mad because they have to read out loud and they just act bad, so they don't have to read out loud because they can't read and they don't want anybody to know that, right? So all of those factors, we have to get to like, what is the root of this behavior? And we have to really, because we do gymnastics to figure out what's wrong with white children. We do gymnastics to figure out what's wrong with them. Acrobats, you know, we bend all kind of ways, matrixing to figure out what's wrong with the little white child. You feel what I'm saying? And so like, we need to be able to do that for Black children as well, figuring out, and we also need representation. Black students need Black teachers, Black administrators that understand them, their culture, what they're saying, because sometimes the schools are so segregated. And as a result, the teachers have become used to working with certain populations of children, and they have these preferences about children that they work with, and they've written off other children due to anti-Blackness. So we just need a total revamping. We don't need another Snoopy in the sky surveilling.
I want to get to Marissa, go ahead.
We need Snoopy. We need more school resources, just not officers.
Larissa.
Yes, just gonna add. Yeah, we in Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system is one of the most segregated school systems in the country. We know this. We also have more cops in schools than we do nurses. I remember fighting for that when I was a freshman in high school. And more specifically, we don't want to be honest about the conditions that students are living in and how that affects your ability to perform and show up. And then lastly, was just going to add that we need well-resourced, well-supported counselors. I had 3 or 4 counselors in my high school at South Meck, and all of them were tired, exhausted, and quit within the year. We need counselors that can actually show up and support students. Teachers that actually understand those conditions, because the white teachers I had were also deeply anti-Black in the AP programs I was a part of, and enforced very specific ideas of what Blackness should be. So not only do we need to like support Black teachers, build that, but we really need to like think differently about how abolition can be a part of schooling and teaching there. Bonita Buford is a writer and former teacher who talks deeply about how we can revamp our school systems to move towards abolition. And I think that's a really good resource for folks, but specifically getting rid of cops. If nothing else, cops need to be not in schools in general.
Councilman.
I agree with my colleagues, right? I think they all make great points. More school nurses in school, less police officers, better guidance counselors, less police officers, more teacher assistants, less police officers, better pay for teachers so we get a better caliber of people in the classroom, and specifically male teachers in the building to communicate with our Black boys. So I agree with my colleagues that they're absolutely right. We don't need a uniformed officer walking on the school grounds. We do need someone, though, again, looking out for the safety and the security of our kids. But I don't think it necessarily has to be a uniformed police officer.
Okay, throwing this question out. Someone asked this in the chat: how can we reintroduce civics to our curriculum? Because again, I believe that civics is one of those things you talk to people, they have no idea how local, county government, even sometimes national government works. So how do we get that back in the curriculum? Start with you, Councilman Grant.
That's a great question. And, I support charter schools, right? I think we have to support our public school system. We should fund our public school system, but some kids don't do well in that environment. And so we have a charter school, they can come up with their own curriculum. They can teach African-American history, which I think is really important as well. They can talk about civic education in terms of how a bill becomes a law, how to engage your city council, how to be an activist. We're missing so much in our schools that we're not teaching that afforded me the opportunity to be a better student, because we just kind of did stuff, home economics, right? I learned how to cook and do things and be self-supporting. And so I support public schools. I believe we should fund them appropriately. But again, I love the charter school system because it allows for greater flexibility in the introduction of new topics that historically have been taken out of the public school system.
Christy, to you, and I have another question for you, so please, 30 seconds on this question.
So I think we have to make civics fun and engaging. Civics, when it was taught to me, was very boring. And so we have to figure out ways to make it engaging. I'm actually working on, we have the Civics 101 event that we're having and trying to figure out how to make it engaging. And so for me, it's stories. The more community participation that we have to discuss these concepts, the more people that we have to ask questions, I think that makes it better. I don't know how to get it into the schools, quite frankly, because they got Common Core math and I'm trying to figure out how to help my children with their homework more so than I am Civics 101, just to be honest. They don't add and subtract the way we used to. So like all of that is a thing. So I think it's lots of barriers that we have to this education piece.
Okay. Clarissa?
Yeah, I will say my range on abolition works at prisons and like journalism. So I would trust CMS teachers, specifically Black CMS teachers, about what that would look like. But I also understand that like the North Carolina GOP has been just the worst, has been the most conservative space in getting those curriculum pushes. So I know that there are amazing radical teachers on the ground who are organizing to change that curriculum. And I think a lot of that comes with being honest about our history. I got pushback from every AP teacher I had at South Meck about being honest about the racism that we were studying. And a lot of it was taught by white men. So I know that I trust the community of Black teachers in Charlotte that they're doing that work, and also understand that those curriculum changes are running up against a very white conservative GOP that does not want our children to learn that stuff.
So Christy, this question is specifically for you with regards to violent domestic situations. If you are a social worker or a therapist assigned to a violent domestic situation, do you suggest that they be accompanied by an officer?
So if we're talking about like in the moment, potentially they could be, but again, we have to make sure that the people who respond to domestic violence, number one, understand the dynamics of an interpersonal violence relationship. And so it's not the same as everyone else who may be fighting. And so if these counselors aren't specifically trained to deal in this type of violence, this type of familial violence, then they would be doing more harm than good as well. And so I would suggest what would happen is that, number one, we listen to the people who are actively involved in what they think needs to happen. I knew the police would try to tell me like, you need to get a 50B, which is a restraining order. But I knew if I got that restraining order, that would be something that would agitate my abuser so much that he probably would kill me. So we have to trust that the victim is the expert in what should happen, that they just, again, are furthest from the resources and the power. And we have to trust that the victim's decisions have kept them alive this long, and we need to be invested in what they say should happen. So instead of maybe if people call 911, they could call, but the dispatcher asks, what would you like to see happen? What would you think would be helpful? Would be much better than just blanketly saying police, fire, medic, and then sending police, fire, medic. Those are the types of individualized responses that we're going to have in place in order to address individual issues.
And so for the three of you, the question on the table is, how can we as a community start to imagine a society with less policing? Is that even plausible? Is it possible? How do you wrap folks' minds around it? So I'm gonna start with you, Clarissa.
Yeah, I think that the world without police is possible and necessary because living in Greertown, we only saw cops when the cops rolled by. You know what I mean? Like Black people know how to live without police. We know how to resolve conflict when we trust each other and when we build community. So I think a big part of this is like also like getting to know your neighbors. I've lived in buildings where you know domestic violence is happening. And in building those relationships, a lot of times you can ask questions around like, is calling the cops needed? If not, if that would make things more detrimental, then how do you solve that as a building? How do you ask those questions and get people safe? Because a lot of the times when there was domestic violence happening, the survivor would stay at somebody's house for a week. They would make sure their kids were safe for the week and do what's needed, because a lot of times when cops show up, moving out isn't as easy because you are financially tied to your abuser. Your kids go to school in that area. You can't just move out and get a new apartment. So I think it's really important for us to think about the world without police by trusting our communities and building those relationships. Because if you don't, then the police become the authority to solve conflicts when in fact they will escalate things and make them worse.
Councilman?
I think it's not a world or a country or a community with less police, but how can police be conducted differently, right? How does that look from today, and how can we reform it so it looks different from how it is actually on the ground today? How can we utilize, and again, 40% of the city council budget is for police. How can we reduce that and provide those resources to other avenues? What does police reform look like? And how do we get there in a manner that continues to protect the community, but acknowledges the fact that policing has, in some respects, gone too far. That my panelists are absolutely right in terms of who shows up, right? Does a guy or lady in a car with a badge and the gun shows up to help a situation, or does that helper looks differently with a different function? So I don't think it's less policing, but how can policing be done differently? What does police reform look like? How do we allocate funds for policing, and those resources that that are more wants versus needs for policing? How are those dollars redirected differently?
Thank you. Christy?
I'm a shift about what violence is and who is violent. The system is way more violent than any individual has ever been towards another individual. And so we have to redefine what is violent and what is safety. We do need to build a safe society and a safe community. We do that, though, through making sure that people are connected and have relationships, because again, relationships and communities keep people safe, not cops and cages, because despite police and despite cages, we still see an increase. So it's not working. What we incarcerating people, sending the police is not a deterrent. It has not worked in all of these years, and it's not going to work for the foreseeable future. So we really do need to figure out what are the things that actually give us a return on the investment that we're making. Because so far, we keep coming up with short, insufficient funds, in the words of Martin Luther King. The check keeps coming back, insufficient funds. And so we need to see a return on our investment. And I'm sure as a business person, Councilman Graham can understand that we have to diversify when we are investing. And so far, we've been putting all of our investments into the police. And so we need to diversify our portfolio so that we see a larger return on the investment. And we will see that through the outcomes of our community.
Thank you. And so we have reached the point. We have exhausted our time tonight. So we are at the point where I'm getting ready to say goodnight to all of you. But first, I want to thank you all for joining us. I'm going to start with you, Christy. As always, vocal in our community, always seen, need to work on those dance moves. I saw you a little earlier. But any parting words that you have for folk, how they can get involved?
Yeah, always check out the ACLU of North Carolina. We are constantly working, especially here in the Charlotte community and in the Triangle, but really across the state, to ensure that civil rights and civil liberties across the state are protected. And so you can always follow the ACLU or me at Christy_1979 to remain involved.
Thank you so much. Have a great evening and enjoy the rest of your night. Clarissa, thank you so much for joining us. Remember, it's hot down here in North Carolina too. I know it's hot in DC, but any parting words you want to leave with folk?
Yeah, for Black folks, for white folks that are a part of this, let me take that back, just for Black folks. Yeah, join an organization. There's so much important work that's happening on the ground that involves unpacking and unlearning, learning how capitalism is failing us, learning how policing is failing us. So I ask folks to join organizations, take time to read. Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis is a really great starting point, and I hope that folks take the time to do that work.
Well, thank you for joining us this evening. You enjoy the rest of your night as well.
Bye, y'all.
And finally, to my fellow Johnson C. Smith University Golden Bull and my District 2 councilman, Malcolm, thank you for joining us tonight. We know you're busy, and we know you're going to be even busier now with things that have happened today as well. But anything you want to leave with the community, anything you want to leave with the district?
Just want to thank my panelists. The young ladies are really, really sharp. And I truly believe that the people will lead, the leaders will follow. So I just encourage them to continue to do the good work that they're doing on the ground. I want to thank you, Keith, for having me, and the Harvey B. Gantt Center for giving me this platform to talk about issues facing our community. And to the residents of District 2, keep the faith and do the work. What's happening in our community does not define who we are. It doesn't define our goals, our objectives, and does not define us as a people. And so, like my sister would always say, keep the faith, do the work. And that's what I'm committed to do. And that's what I'm asking all the residents of District 2 to do. Simply keep the faith, do the work.
Thank you, sir. You enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
And finally, we want to thank the Gantt Center for allowing us a safe space to do this work and to have these conversations. Our community is in flux, but we've got to do the work, as Councilman Graham said. So thank you to the Gantt Center. Thank you, David Taylor, for allowing us. And I'm going to turn this back over to Afeni.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Keith. Thank you for your words and for leading tonight's discussion. The Gantt Center has been able to provide programs and vital conversations because of supporters like yourself. With our Text to Give option, you can continue your support in a convenient way, and it allows us to continue and expand our mission. So text Unmasked to 345-345, and your contributions, big or small, are appreciated by the Gantt Center. We thank you all for tuning in, for your powerful questions and comments. And until next time, as always, please take care and be safe. Good night.